I want to begin this commentary by apologizing for my recent absence. To make it up to my audience, I will be covering something I planned on commentating on at the time, but didn't get around to doing such. That being Matt Walsh's response to John Oliver's segment on the topic of transgender athletes. By the way, just so you all know, I had to fuck with the Last Week Tonight footage in order to get it up onto YouTube. Even though I've used footage of Last Week Tonight before on this channel, and even though Matt Walsh's video is still up. Yeah, apparently, despite the fact I'm defending Last Week Tonight, I need to alter my footage to keep this video from being blocked worldwide. I don't get company sometimes, but if the footage looks weird, that's why.
The issue of trans athletes has become very important to conservatives in general and Donald Trump in particular. He talked about it at length in his address to Congress and signed an order titled Keeping Men Out of Women's Sports, which promised to rescind all funds from educational programs that allowed trans women and girls to compete. This issue is an obsession for Republicans. Last year, they spent over $116 million just on TV ads featuring trans athletes, and the relentless focus on this over the years has had a meaningful impact, with one poll showing more than 6 in 10 adults say trans girls and women should not be allowed to compete in girls' and women's sports, including high school and youth levels.
So he starts with the old, why are you so obsessed with this routine, as expected.
No, he started by calling this a hot-button issue. He never criticized people for caring about it. All he's doing is setting the stage.
He then says that this obsession by Republicans is the reason why 6 in 10 adults don't want men in women's sports. Now, the actual number is more like 8 in 10.
You got any evidence for that, or are you just saying it without providing any sort of citation?
Either way, he says that Republicans have waged a relentless propaganda campaign against trans people, and that is why so many Americans now agree with them. Oliver has this, of course, completely backwards. John, let me ask you this. What did the poll on trans athletes say 20 years ago?
I may not have that, but I do have Gallup polling data from 2023, which showed positive opinion of transgender athletes going down 8 points from 2021 to, well, 2023. Meaning the idea of an organized campaign against it, lowering support for it, is far from absurd like Matt makes it out to be. Also, the IOC has allowed transgender athletes since 2004, so it's not as if it's inconceivable that people would have supported it 20 years ago, like Matt's implying. Matt spends the next minute essentially saying that if we had conducted a poll like the one Oliver is talking about previously, we would have seen everybody disagreeing with the notion of trans people in sports. Never mind that we can't even get 100% of people to agree on how chocolate milk is made. Given 7% of adults think it comes from brown cows, Matt is convinced we would have unanimously agreed on this topic previously. Seriously, the idea that at any point in history 100% of people would have agreed that trans people should not be allowed in sports is ridiculous, because at no point in history have 100% of people agreed on anything.
And that's in spite of the fact that in the 1950s, there was precisely nobody pushing what you would now call anti-trans propaganda. Republicans weren't talking about the issue at all, and yet everybody agreed. Everyone, literally everybody on earth agreed that if a thing is called women's, it should only be for women.
Again, I find the idea of every single human being on earth agreeing about anything to be downright absurd, and you have done absolutely nothing to back up this notion other than saying that it sounds correct, which doesn't actually mean anything. Also, there were people pushing transphobic propaganda in the 1950s. Just look at some of the coverage on Christine Jorgensen, the first American to ever undergo a sex change operation, if you would like some evidence of that. I am now going to be fast-forwarding through the remaining minute and a half of Matt's interjection, as it is nothing more than him repeating the point that he already made. Yeah, Matt is far from an expert on brevity, you'll probably notice.
Now, moving on, Oliver next does the thing he always does, where he finds the weakest and most easily mocked version of the counter-argument, and then frames the entire rest of his rant around that one single example. Watch.
And let's start by acknowledging many people do have good faith questions about this, even if they're asking them a little clumsily. Here's an example of one of those questions about fairness, coming from a less than ideal source.
Let's say Serena's in her prime, and who knows? We'll make up the person, right? So let's not make up the person. Let's say that Rafa Nadal, has some issue, or wants to transition and wins the Wimbledon final, or somebody wins the 100-meter dash at the Olympic. I think that's a net negative.
Now, clearly, when it comes to questions of right and wrong in sports, Lance Armstrong might be the last person you'd call, just after the 1919 Chicago White Sox and the ear chunk that Mike Tyson bit off.
Now, if you wanted to find an example of somebody making the case against men and women's sports, you have literally thousands of options to choose from. Thousands and thousands of people have made this case on camera. Female athletes, biologists, doctors, highly credentialed scientific experts in any number of related fields. But John sifted through all of that and went with Lance Armstrong, because Lance Armstrong is infamous for cheating in a sport.
Yeah, this would be a great point in everything if Lance Armstrong was the only person John Oliver showed, but he's simply not. People like Riley Gaines and several politicians, including Donald Trump and Mike Johnson, are shown throughout the segment as examples of people who oppose trans athletes. Armstrong was likely only even shown in this clip for the added humor of him specifically being the one making this criticism in one case, given this is a comedy show. It's not as if Armstrong is some sort of bizarro human where every time he declares somebody is cheating, they by definition can't be. Hell, Oliver immediately goes on to admit that he can understand the concern of Lance Armstrong's hypothetical. Here's how that clip continues.
To be fair, I can see how at the most elite level of sports, an instantaneous switch like that would confer an advantage. It hasn't happened. And for what it's worth, in tennis, the WTA already has guidelines for trans inclusion, requiring athletes maintain strict hormone levels for at least 2 years before competing, with processes for dispute resolutions if necessary. So they're already thinking about this, and I presume will continue to do that.
Oliver then discusses how common extremist hypotheticals are on this topic, despite them not bearing much of a resemblance to the reality of these situations.
Thing is, hypotheticals like that circulate constantly and often centre around someone transitioning solely to gain a competitive advantage. But as this trans researcher points out, that is an absurd proposition.
It seems like this idea was fully engaged with despite its unfortunate source, so what exactly is the problem here? Matt goes on to drill this point into his audience's head, along with saying that John Oliver only responds to this argument, which again is just simply not true.
Now, of course, even the weakest version of our argument offered by the weakest spokesman is still totally devastating to John's side. Our weakest argument is made of steel compared to the flimsy Fantasyland nonsense that you hear from the pro-trans side. Now, Armstrong is, in fact, correct. If all it takes for a man to be a woman is to identify as one, then if Nadal or any other championship-level male athlete identified as a female, he would now be a female by your logic. There's nothing stopping him from dominating women's sports or women's tennis like Shaquille O'Neal in his prime playing basketball against a bunch of 9-year-olds. The point isn't that Nadal is actually likely to do this. It's that the policy that John Oliver advocates for and the position that he takes would make that sort of absurdity possible, which tells us that it's an absurd policy.
First off, if this is really such a devastating knockout to Oliver's position, despite it being the weakest possible argument from the worst possible spokesman, why the fuck did you just put so much emphasis on that in the first place? You didn't even just make it an offhanded mention, you made it the entire point for a significant chunk of time. Second off, how do you know that's what Oliver advocates for? He goes on to specifically say there are ways to allow trans people in sports without also allowing the hypothetical Lance Armstrong mentioned, and he seems to have no criticism of those based off of the segment, so it seems like you're just making up what he thinks.
Trans women don't transition for sports. No one has ever said, oh yeah, I think I'd like to be a woman so I can do well in women's sports. When you go through a gender transition, you lose so many things in life. My own mother said she never wanted to speak to me again. I lost friends, family, got divorced. You'd go through all of that just to win a medal in sports? No. Trans people transition because it's the only way that we can live happily.
Right. No one says, I'm going to transition just for the sake of sports.
Oh, they don't? Well, first of all, John, how do you know that? I mean, there are many examples of mediocre male athletes who, after not succeeding against the men, suddenly discover their latent female identity. Leah Thomas is just one of many examples. How do you know that the fact that he could go from the middle of the pack to first by a mile isn't what motivated him to make the switch?
That's not how this works. You have to show evidence it's the case. You can't just merely go, well, how can you prove it's not, as if that means anything. Matt then calls the scientist John Oliver Sykes selfish because her transitioning had social consequences. And therefore, this proves that all trans people are selfish and would do anything to feel validated. With Matt's evidence, again, just being an incredibly uncharitable interpretation of what a single trans person says.
So at any rate, none of this matters. None of this is even remotely related to the actual point. Okay, the reason for their, quote, transition is totally irrelevant. It does not matter. It makes no difference. Nothing that John has said to this point, nothing even comes close to actually addressing our arguments.
What do you mean by our arguments? For somebody who just brought up the idea of it being impossible to prove that this isn't the case in at least one situation, you sure are comfortable doing exactly that right now. John is basing this point off of Lance Armstrong's hypothetical, which you directly said you thought was a completely valid point. So, obviously, not only does somebody make this argument, but clearly a different person, you, agrees with it.
It is obviously true that on average, cisgender men and post-pubescent boys have some specific athletic performance advantages, though the relative size of that advantage also depends on the sport and the event. In swimming, for instance, male athletic performance advantage is roughly 13% in the 50-metre freestyle, but less than 6% in the 1,500-metre free, which is still clearly significant. But in general, there's a lot of overlap in the average performance ranges of men and women. Basically, it is not the case that any man is going to be stronger or more athletic than every woman.
It's not the case that any man is stronger and more athletic than every woman, says John Oliver. And in saying this, he has expertly knocked down and dismantled an argument that literally no one on earth at any point anywhere has ever made.
For those curious, here is the very next thing out of John Oliver's mouth.
Which is sometimes what gets implied here, including by Donald Trump, who brought Riley Gaines, the former college swimmer who's become one of the most prominent voices on this issue, on stage to say this.
John then plays a clip of Donald Trump speaking, which he believes provides an example of this being implied. Again, although not directly stated. I will grant you this is a bit of a reach on John's part. However, Matt does nothing to engage with the evidence John Oliver provides. Instead, he just sort of mocks John Oliver for even saying it. Matt continues his interjection by calling John Oliver weak in a joke that goes on for way too fucking long. Matt then talks about how males on average do better in sports than those who are female, which is something John Oliver already fucking conceded to. It was in that clip you just played, Matt. He directly said what you are saying now, albeit he did so without dragging out his argument as much. Matt then gives completely unsourced examples to back up his notion that, again, John Oliver didn't even disagree with. It is impossible to stress how frustrating I find this video to be.
It's why you could find hundreds of examples just like this one. Andrea Yearwood and Terry Miller, both males, finished first and second in the 55-meter dash at the Women's State Indoor Track and Field Championships in Connecticut a few years ago. Miller also finished first in the 300-meter. Miller won the gold with a time of 38.9 seconds. Second place was a full second behind him, which is a near eternity in track time. But if Miller had raced against the boys in the same event, he would have been about 2 seconds behind the guy who finished in 25th place. So to reiterate, his winning time against the girls would have put him far outside of the top 25 in the men's field.
Yeah, and Miller also lost to Chelsea Mitchell, a cisgender woman, in 2020.
The worst guy on the men's track team can instantly become the best person on the girls' team. That's the point. Or at least it's the point about the athletic advantages. But even that point is not the point. John Oliver still has not addressed the actual point.
Yeah, and John already responded to that by pointing out rules were stricter than you seem to realize. Also, if this isn't something you care about, Matt, you do know you don't have to respond to it, right? You seem perfectly willing to cut out parts of what Oliver says that aren't relevant, so just skip to the things you personally believe to be the point.
Here she is explaining what we do and don't know at this point.
It is undoubtedly true that trans women will maintain advantages in some sports. Probably not so much in endurance sports, but in size and strength sports. Trans women will also have some physiological disadvantages. Our larger frames are now being powered by reduced muscle mass and reduced aerobic capacity, and that can lead to disadvantages in terms like quickness, recovery, endurance, things that maybe aren't quite as obvious as being bigger and stronger.
Right, bigger and stronger bodies are not automatically advantaged in every scenario. I mean, put The Rock in a pure bar class and see what happens. I mean, we know what would happen. He'd take a video of himself, caption it, "Mad respect to these mamas, everyone go see Moana 2, and try to use it to sell his tequila before eating 13,000 pancakes and drinking a cow. We know what would happen. But the degree of difference here matters, because we expect a certain amount of difference in athletics. Taller basketball players are expected to compete against shorter ones. Faster soccer players compete against slower ones. Michael Phelps was allowed to compete with other swimmers despite being part dolphin. And crucially, none of the studies I've mentioned so far bear much relevance to what these new laws target, which is youth sports, usually of all ages. And the research there is even more scant. We have no research about how being trans or undergoing gender-affirming treatment impacts athletic performance in teens.
Matt begins this interjection by, and I am not joking here, talking about how John Oliver used the example of an aerobics class for the sake of his joke as opposed to an actual sporting event. You know, for a guy who's so insistent on this idea that John Oliver isn't discussing the point trademark, I can't help but wonder how exactly this information is central to what Oliver said. Matt then mocks John Oliver for discussing the lack of studies on this topic. He says that John is baffled by it, even though he's really not. He's just acknowledging that we don't have a lot of data on this topic. Matt says that people's perception of who they are isn't going to inherently change their biology, which is completely accurate and also has literally nothing to do with the point. Again, Oliver refuted this notion earlier in the video, and you called it essentially a straw man.
So what John is really talking about here are men who have undergone a medical transition, quote unquote. We're being told that after transition, the physical advantages are diminished, supposedly. Now, does this mean that John Oliver is saying that only male athletes who've taken the drugs should be allowed to compete against women? No, he's not even saying that. At least he doesn't appear to be saying that. His only real argument in favor of men and women's sports is that supposedly men who've taken the transition drugs become weaker and slower, but he actually doesn't follow that argument through to its conclusion and say that only men who've transitioned should compete. So again, this whole thing is a red herring. It's irrelevant.
Or he's just calling it more nuanced than people seem to realize. Also, if you can already infer that's the conclusion of his argument based off of what he's saying, why the fuck does he need to spoon feed it to you? You literally just said that's not what he appears to be saying, despite also essentially making the case that it is, yes, what he appears to be saying. Matt then argues that the results of hormone replacement therapy inherently means it's destroying the bodies of those who undergo it, because that holds some relevance, I guess, in the mind of him and him exclusively. The rest of the video is just Matt saying he doesn't believe trans women to be women and criticizing John Oliver for not discussing that topic, even though it's not what he decided to focus on, because doing such is not relevant to the points he felt were most important to this issue. You can disagree with that if you want. However, Oliver has the right to subjectively think these are the most important facts regarding the topic in question. Good night, and good luck.